Hello and welcome to the Alternative Path with me, David Robson. I'm really excited this week to get on a lady called Clare Baker. Now, Clare is somebody I spoke to way back in 2020. She'd never come on the podcast before, but we had a couple of conversations, and Clare reached out to me again on LinkedIn. So had a chat with her, and she has come on the podcast today. So Clare is somebody, she is from Restlessminds UK. They're an online support service that provide bespoke, person-centered support to young people and adults. Now, Clare's got a lot of experience in different areas in education, and one of the areas we might touch on today is the area of unschooling. So, Clare, bit of a quick intro from me. So, tell us a bit about you and who you are.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you letting me be here. Yeah, I'm the founder of Restless Minds UK. I'm a late diagnosed neurodivergent adult. My four children range from 27 to 16. Three of them have gone through the mainstream education system, and my daughter was our youngest went through an unschooling process. We removed her from education, so we followed an unschooling path with her. Restless Minds UK was born out of seeing a huge need for support for families who have children who may or may not have a diagnosis around SEND and social, emotional, mental health needs. I was a practitioner for an early intervention organisation for 7 years previous to that, and a research and development lead. And unfortunately, that had to come to an end. That organisation had to close down due to illness. So I just saw this huge gap still there, and I couldn't give up on the fact that there was so much help needed for these families that couldn't access statutory services or the waiting list for too long. So I wanted to be part of bridging that gap. So I set up Restless Minds UK, and I started in September, only of last year.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks for all that. That's I'm going to unpick some of that if that's okay. And
Yeah,
one of the things that first jumped out to me then, probably because it's one of the first things you said was, and I don't think we spoke about this on the call, was yourself being a late diagnosis as neurodivergent. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was younger, I really struggled in school. I was actually excluded from school. Luckily, I went on to go to college and really, really enjoyed that. And I as I didn't really think much of it. I just thought, back in the day, very much everything was based on behaviour. And I kind of just managed through life through various challenging things. And then obviously becoming a parent, still knew knew that there was something that I found a lot of things challenging, but just put it down to, the struggles of life, everyday kind of life. And it actually wasn't until my daughter began to struggle in year, so I'd say 7. So in lockdown, so she was struggling in school. She transferred from year 6 to 7, so into secondary school. And she was okay. She managed to kind of do school for that year. But during lockdown, I actually saw her really thrive, which was, I just thought that was kind of not the way things were supposed to be. It was very much like, you would think at school that she would be learning more, but actually she wasn't. She was thriving at home. And she's always been what I suppose, well, teaching staff would say she was very quiet, and she was just really kind and lovely. But she's just a bit shy, and she's just a bit of a worrier. And at home, she wasn't that young person. She was very much, chatty, and, she was a little bit of a worry, but nowhere near on the level of like anxiety that was based around school. When I saw her thriving, it was a lovely thing to see. But as the times went by to going back to school, her mental health really, really dipped, and she became highly, highly anxious. She then went back into school and just completely crashed. Her mental health was really awful. She was crying every day. She was stressed. She wasn't able to learn. And I started doing my research because of the role that I did. I had an idea about neurodivergence, about kind of autism and ADHD and learning differences, but I didn't really know a lot about the presentation in girls. And finding out, I did a little bit of research and I was like, actually, this could be more than just what I'm being told in terms of she's anxious. And the more research I did, it turned out she actually got a diagnosis of autism and ADHD, and an anxiety disorder. So she went back into school into year 8, and 2 weeks into year 8, I just looked at her and I thought, this is breaking you, this system's breaking you, and we can't allow that as a family to happen. So I removed her from education. She wanted to be removed from mainstream education, so we decided to do that. We tried to replicate the curriculum at home, and that didn't work either. So what we did, in a nutshell, was allow her to take on a path of self-led learning, and that's where unschooling came into it. And going back to the question about my diagnosis, recognizing a lot of the stuff in the research that I was doing, recognizing my needs as a young person, thinking back historically, and then looking at the fact that my daughter's neurodivergent, it's highly likely that a parent of a neurodivergent child is neurodivergent. So I went on my own journey through diagnosis, and I got my diagnosis at 47 of ADHD. So yeah, it was very interesting. It made a lot of sense to me. I haven't gone down the path of being assessed for autism, but that's something I'm absolutely not ruling out for myself as well. So it's one of those things that I think once we know, one of my things that I use in my work is when we know better, we do better. So I think in terms of looking beyond just the behaviour, I think is key. If I'd had, and the reason why I set up Restlessminds UK as well, is if I'd had somebody when I was younger that understood how I was feeling and the things that I was finding challenging, I think I would have engaged in learning a lot better. But because that didn't exist back then, I now want to be that person for young people. So it's kind of multi-layered. It's my own diagnosis, my daughter's journey, and wanting to, when I've worked in the last 7 years for the early intervention organisation, having just so much exposure to what is going on out there for families and young people and how much they're struggling.
Thanks. Again, loads of really useful info there. I want a couple of and thanks for sharing.
It's okay.
A couple of things I want to pick into there. For anyone listening who might not have much of an understanding around autism. So one of the things you mentioned was masking girls. Now, like we hear about it a lot at work and through being involved in schools myself, but masking in boys and girls is very, very different. Can you kind of go into that at all? That
Yeah,
piece?
absolutely. There's a real significant difference between a typical, and I'm not saying this is obviously for everybody, because a lot of boys, can mask in a very, very similar way to girls as well. But the typical presentation that most people will understand, if we're thinking, I'll talk about ADHD first, is so there are actually 3 different types of ADHD, which not many people realise. When I'm talking to families, they get a diagnosis for their child of ADHD and get given a few pieces of paper, and it's like, off you go. And they don't really know what to do or where to go or how to help their young person. So knowing the basics, I think, is really, really important from a parent point of view and an educational point of view, because you can have a predominantly hyperactive child or with ADHD, you could have a predominantly inattentive ADHD. So, or you can have combined, which is like characteristics of both, which can merge, which their presentation can be different, especially in different environments, depending on how safe a young person feels in an environment. So when we're talking, and like autistic girls as well tend to mask a lot in terms of there's many different responses our brains go into. You've heard like fight, flight, response, can't you? Like it can be a trauma response as well. But there's actually so much more to it, because there's a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop response. There's 5 modes that our brain and young people's brains will go into when they're stressed. So, for example, if you're working, so in my job, I work a lot with young neurodivergent people that have barriers to attendance or emotional based school avoidance. And what will happen is they will be going into a school setting or a learning setting. It's normally a mainstream setting, and they will be masking. And when I say masking, their presentation will be just to try really hard to blend in and to fit in, which we could call a fawn response, because a fawn response is like a people pleaser response. So a lot of young people, especially girls, will sit within that response. And what you'll see is not, these are like young people, normally girls that go under the radar, that are not seen as being challenging. They're not seen as being disruptive. But what's actually happening, and they're internalizing and they're masking, what they're doing is they're so highly stressed internally that they are actually on survival mode. So when they're in a school setting, they're actually just trying to get through the day. And what you hear a lot is their parent or carer saying, but when they get home, they're having big, like they're dysregulated. They're having, because what's happening is they're masking, they're holding all of this in during the day. And they're coming home and they're totally exhausted, and they're taking it out on their family because they're in their safe space. Whereas if your brain if your whole body and your nervous system doesn't feel safe in an environment, you almost put on that mask to survive that day. And then you come home and then you're in a safe space, and then you fall apart basically. And it can become really exhausting. So masking, and for boys may well do that as well. Boys, their tendency, their presentation, if we're thinking about ADHD, it's normally, when you're thinking of a typical boy like presentation, it's more external, so it's more behavior driven. So you'll get somebody who might become quite disruptive, who might be distracting, who might be moving around a lot, who might not be able to focus. So and in a school setting that doesn't necessarily know a huge amount about ADHD, that's normally viewed as behavior. So it's not about the need underneath the behavior, it's just about managing the behavior, not actually what's going on for that young person in that environment. And girls, the typical, again, this isn't for everybody, but the girl presentation for ADHD is normally inattentive, which means, like when you hear things like, oh, you're such a scatterbrain, you're so forgetful, you're a little daydreamer. So that's normally like a female presentation. But obviously you can get the combined, but you also can get inattentive boys that can be daydreamers, that, so it's a very individual thing. An ADHD diagnosis is just, it won't be the same as two children won't be the same. Same as if you're autistic, your presentation and your characteristics will not be the same. Every neurodivergent child and adult is an individual, and they will experience their neurodiversity in their own way. It's like, you couldn't get 10 individuals that are neurodivergent and they'd all have the same presentation. It doesn't happen. And that's why I think it's so difficult when we're talking about school settings for teachers and staff to be able to understand the needs of each individual in a class of 30 and tailor then, and meet each individual needs in a big setting where you've got lots and lots of children and a lot of demand on a teacher. So that's where I'm seeing a lot of challenges at the moment in my work.
I think that was really interesting, that ADHD kind of lesson you gave there. Yes, that's quite some
I think it's just important, even knowing the basics of ADHD. I think especially if you are in a position where you're working with young people, whether that's teaching or mentoring, it's so important that we have even a basic understanding of neurodiversity.
Definitely. I think one of the things you said there about I talk about like autism for a moment. Like we've got a number of schools, SEN schools, that they're, if you looked on their website or any information, they would they state that they're a school for young people with autism. But we've got, out of all the schools we work with, the spectrum is so vast that it doesn't necessarily mean that if a young person has autism, they should go to that particular school, because we've got schools on both ends of the spectrum for autism, and they are very, very different. It's like a different diagnosis almost. Well, it is a different diagnosis. Like I say, each young person's diagnosis is individual. So yeah,
Yeah, they might not necessarily have an intellectual disability. You can get like neurodivergent people, like autistic people, or people with autism, depending on how you prefer to be, referred to. You can be highly, highly academic and thrive in an academic setting if your needs are being met in other ways.
Yeah. And how did it, the moment you got that diagnosis as an adult and as a mom, how did it, this is like for my own interest, I think, more than anything, but how did it feel like when you got that diagnosis?
You asked my husband. It's the first time I've probably not spoken in a whole car trip. We'd left the clinic and I was like, oh, and I literally sat in silence. I knew, but I think just having that validation, I grieved a little bit. I've grieved a little bit for the younger version of me, because as a young person, I put myself in some really, really quite vulnerable positions and took some risks that I absolutely hope, in my lifetime, my kids don't take, So as a young person, I grieve for my lack of understanding of that. I went to an all-girls convent school. It was very, very strict. It was very, I'd look back at it now, and it was, to me, quite coercive, quite controlling. But that's just the way it was back then. I never questioned it, but there was, every part of me intuitively fought it. I was very, very much like, if someone told me to do something, I would question why I'd have to do it all the time. But there was no room for that. So it's just like, I just didn't fit into their narrative of a young person. And with that, I think there's a lot of shame attached to that. I was told basically I'd amount to nothing. I would not go anywhere in life if I didn't toe the line, basically. And it was quite funny, actually, because the actual school that I was thrown out of, they obviously didn't know who I was, but I got a phone call from them to come in and work for them to actually help their students. So that was my massive aha moment of, oh, actually you were wrong and I was going to be okay. And but it was like, I walked into my old school and it smelt the same, it looked the same. It was the most surreal feeling walking back in there as an adult, in being paid to go in and work for them, to not employed by them, but to contract into them, to to go and help their students. So it was like, it was a bit like proving to myself that, okay, you didn't fit into mainstream, but that doesn't mean that you can't succeed in life. And I think education is so, so important. I really do. I believe that at my core, I think education is important, but I don't think you can be educated just in one way. And my daughter's proof of that. You don't have to do education in the way that society is telling you to do education. And I don't believe education should finish at 18. I think it's lifelong. I went back to college when I was 40, so you can learn and reinvent yourself at any time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And from settings we visit, there's just always kind of, when we go and visit an SEN school, they're also individual, just like mainstream schools are individual when you walk around them. But we always kind of leave with like, each of those schools is doing something that is unique to their learners, that you just think, I completely know why mainstream schools don't have the capacity to tailor education like us. I get that, but I also we always leave, and in the car, if there's two of us, we'll be like, oh, if only they could do stuff like that in mainstream, if only they could do that, and maybe that would that. Yeah, so it's really, really interesting one. And one of the other things I wanted to pick up on is, and I've spoken to a lot of people in the past, and I think it's quite quite relatable, I think, is, you mentioned being the person you didn't have as a young person. And I'm guessing since getting diagnosis yourself, that probably has just ignited even more, I guess, has it?
Yeah, I think I've always had I think obviously since having, well, not even knowing that I had ADHD, I've always had that drive and passion to support young people. Um, but my my drive towards really sharing knowledge around neurodivergence and how it can impact young people in every part of their life is really kind of ramped up. But I've I approach things in a very different way through my work, because I feel that having the last kind of the exposure for the last 7 years, I've worked with so many families that are in limbo and they're stuck because of systems, because everything's overwhelmed and budgets are being cut and the waiting lists are longer. It was almost like all I ever saw was very disempowered and people that were lost, not knowing where to go. So if their child wasn't able to attend school and they were experiencing mental health challenges or social emotional mental health, they would be on a waiting list for CAMS, or they would be on a reduced timetable, but that's only for 2 weeks, and that wasn't necessarily, that's going to change. And there was so much uncertainty and reliance on waiting for answers from systems that I decided that the way that I was going to approach things and the way I wanted to be kind of different and stand out was actually about empowerment. It's like, okay, stop waiting and start doing this stuff yourself. Stop waiting and start upskilling, start learning, start researching, build your own village, build your own support network, begin to reach out, make connections, start reading, do research. So helping others to help themselves rather than waiting for answers and waiting for other systems to tell them what to do. This is about, as a parent, we can take that power and say, my child's struggling. I know there's only a limited amount of resources out there that are going to help them, but I can almost create my own solution. So I really love my work in helping families to be able to move forward rather than staying stuck. And that's kind of where my own diagnosis and understanding myself and my needs and my younger self, and watching my daughter just thrive through, some really challenging things, has given me almost the confidence that it's like, that is the way, that's the only option that some people have now. And that's the way that I work, is solution based and empowerment based and going forward, rather than just allowing, yeah, almost like enabling people to be stuck and not do anything. It's like, let's do stuff ourselves.
I imagine from like a parent's side when they're going through that process, a lot of it is they just don't know what options are there, but a lot of it is fear as well, isn't it? I would
Absolutely.
imagine of like we're all as parents, will just want the best for your children, and
Yeah.
sometimes you can only kind of go on what's in front of you, can't you? When you
Yeah.
don't know, like if I'm honest, I fully am aware of homeschooling. I know kind of that, but I wasn't really aware of unschooling until
Yes,
till
it's
we
quite a big
spoke.
American thing. Yeah, there's not there's more and more people doing it now. The home education like community is growing huge. It's huge because I think a lot more people are recognizing that their child's needs can't be met in a mainstream and they're limited to any alternate provisions. So a lot of people are just empowering themselves and stepping into that and building communities. And the lovely thing is there's more and more communities out there, so you're more likely to get support. The first the first hurdle, I think, when I didn't have a clue about home education, my conditioning, probably the same as most people my age that have got children and people younger than me, our conditioning is school is the holy grail to everything. You go to school, you sit your exams, you get a job, you work in that job, you might change that job, you earn money, you buy a house, you retire, kids, grandkids, and then you die, and that's your lifeline. And it's like, that's all mapped out for us. And all of a sudden, and that was kind of mapped out for me, because my conditioning was, yeah, of course you've got to go to school. of course you do. When I was young, it's like, well, could you go to school? That's what you do. There's not an option. Excuse me. So I had to battle with my own conditioning, even though my experience at school was negative. My in my instinct was, well, it's either my child's mental health or GCSEs, and it wasn't a question. I was just like, she can do that anytime she wants to. I need to make sure she's well. And to me, I always say when people say, how did you do it? It is scary. Of course, it's scary because if you don't know, of course, going into something you don't know is scary. And I say to people, it was the hardest but easiest decision ever. It was the hardest because I had loads of questions like, am I going to fail her? Am I taking her opportunities away? What about, and again, that normal question everyone comes up with like that, oh, how are they going to socialize? How are they going to make friends? There was many, many challenges around that. But when I looked at her and actually really looked at how much she was actually learning, being in a setting as a neurodivergent child that didn't necessarily meet her needs. And that's not the fault of the school. That's because mainstream schools aren't set up for that. Yes, they have brilliant, some people have, schools have brilliant SEND departments, some, have some brilliant teachers. Unfortunately, not all of them do. And also, young people don't always engage in that because they don't want to be seen to be different. And that is a big challenge as well. When you have young people in a mainstream setting where the support is there, it's like they don't want to be seen as different because the pressure from their friends and things. So it was a hard journey, but at my core, I knew her mental health had to come first. So it was easy and hard, if that makes sense. But I had to do it. I had to do it. I had no choice.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Well, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, there's loads of really useful stuff we've spoken about there. But what does the future hold for you and Restless Minds? And what's your have you got a plan for the future? Where do you want to kind of take things with Restless Minds?
To be honest, I'm busy. I've only started in September, and I'm really busy, and I want to keep a balance between loving what I do and being very mindful of my own capacity to help people. So I only see a limited amount of families and young people every week because you hear some quite harrowing things and it's quite heavy, the work. So I'm very careful about how much exposure, because I'm a mum and I'm a wife and I'm a human. So I can only hold so much of other people's trauma without it impacting my life. So I offer my one-to-one, but what I also offer is a free help desk, as in anybody can just message me any questions. I offer a free drop-in once a month, so it's coupled with Claire, where I just sit on a Zoom, and anybody who's got questions or worries, they can just drop into that. And I offer free signposting. So like you said earlier, some of the most challenging things is knowing what do I do? Where do I go? And they are the questions that I can answer for people if they need a question answering, if they're a young person struggling, maybe they're not in a position where they can afford one-to-one mentoring with me, but there'll be absolutely no charge for asking me questions about where can I go to get help with X, Y, and Z, whatever it is that they need. That's just all free stuff that I do as part of Restless Minds, because I want to reach as many people as I can and help them.
Brilliant. Well, Claire, I think it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you talk, and the passion is clearly there and pretty strong. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for being open and honest. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll drop some links to I think you've got a Facebook page.
I've got a Facebook page.
I'll put some links in the comments. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All the best.
Thanks,
Claire.
Thanks. Take care.